What we witnessed moments ago was not a dramatic victory speech, not a triumphant declaration of power, but something far more revealing, a reluctant step backward disguised as strategy. For months, the rhetoric was loud and uncompromising. Big promises, sharp threats, and the suggestion that pressure alone could bend geography, sovereignty, and international law. The idea was simple: push hard enough, raise the stakes high enough, and eventually others will give way. But reality has a way of interrupting even the boldest narratives. And when confronted with unified resistance and undeniable limits, that confident march turned into a careful retreat. This wasn't a sudden change of heart driven by diplomacy or reflection. It was a climb down shaped by resistance, quiet at first, then increasingly firm. Allies pushed back, not with outrage, but with calm resolve. Arctic sovereignty was treated not as a bargaining chip, but as a red line. Economic threats were met with the reminder that trade flows both ways. Military posturing was answered by alliance cohesion. And slowly, unmistakably, the room changed. The leverage that once seemed overwhelming began to evaporate, not because the ambition disappeared, but because the cost of pursuing it became impossible to ignore. What makes this moment so significant is not just the reversal itself, but what it tells us about power in the modern world. For a long time, many believed that sheer force of personality amplified by economic size and military weight could still dictate outcomes. That the old playbook of pressure-first diplomacy could be revived with enough volume and bravado. Yet this episode exposed a hard truth. Even the most influential actors operate within boundaries. When those boundaries are defended collectively, threats lose their sharpness, and bluster meets its limits. There was no formal admission of defeat, of course, there never is. Instead, the language softened. The urgency faded. The demands were reframed and misunderstood or exploratory. What was once presented as inevitable suddenly became optional. This is how modern climb downs happen, not with apologies, but with silence, redirection, and a shift of attention. And yet, for anyone watching closely, the signal was clear. The push had failed. The resistance held. This moment also underscores how much the global balance has changed. Smaller nations and regions are no longer isolated voices waiting to be overrun by larger ambitions. They are embedded in networks, economic, diplomatic, and security-based, that amplify their strength. When one is pressured, many respond. And that collective response doesn't need to shout to be effective. It simply needs to be consistent. That consistency is what turned pressure into pause, and pause into retreat. There's another layer here, and it's psychological. The expectation was dominance, the outcome was restraint. And restraint, when forced rather than chosen, leaves an impression. It reveals vulnerability, not weakness, but limitation. It reminds the world that power today is negotiated as much as it is asserted. That reputations are shaped not only by what leaders demand, but by what they are ultimately forced to accept. For audience watching from home, this might seem like just another geopolitical headline, another flashpoint that cooled before it ignited. But beneath the surface, it represents something deeper, a recalibration. It shows that the era of unilateral moves dressed up as inevitabilities is being challenged by a more interconnected, more assertive international community. It shows that economic threats are less effective when supply chains are diversified. It shows that political pressure falters when alliances are intact. And it shows that even the loudest voices must eventually listen when the room speaks back. Perhaps most importantly, this moment sends a message to others who may be tempted to test similar tactics elsewhere. The lesson is clear: ambition without consent carries a cost. Pressure without partners has limits. And sovereignty, once defended collectively, is not easily bargained away. The climb down we just witnessed wasn't about one place or one dispute. It was about the boundaries of modern power itself, why one voice was forced into retreat. Another rose not through spectacle, not through threats, but through clarity. In a room filled with power, wealth, and carefully scripted optimism, what captured attention was not volume but substance. The message landed because it named what many feel but few say out loud: that the global order everyone relies on is no longer holding itself together by habit alone. It now requires choice. It requires defense. And above all, it requires honesty. What made this moment stand out was its contrast. Instead of framing the world as something to be dominated, it was framed as something fragile, valuable, but vulnerable. Instead of pretending that the old rules still work automatically, there was an acknowledgement that they are being tested daily by coercion, economic pressure, and geopolitical impatience. That kind of honesty cuts through noise. It commands attention without demanding it. There was no nostalgia in the message, no attempt to rewind history to a simpler time. The point wasn't to preserve the past, but to protect the future. The argument was clear: when rules are bent by the powerful and ignored when inconvenient, the damage doesn't stop at borders. It spreads into markets, supply chains, currencies, and ultimately into the lives of ordinary people. Stability, we were reminded, is not an abstract concept, it's the reason pensions exist, trade flows, and economies grow without constant shock. What truly shifted the room was the emphasis on responsibility beyond superpowers. Middle powers were no longer cast as spectators caught between giants, but as anchors of balance. Nations with influence, credibility, and economic weight were called upon to act not aggressively, but collectively. Not to dominate, but to stabilize. It was a reminder that global leadership today doesn't always come from the biggest military or the loudest rhetoric, but from the willingness to stand firm when pressure mounts. The idea resonated because it spoke directly to the moment we're living in. People sense that something has changed, that agreements once taken for granted are being questioned, that economic weapons are replacing diplomacy, that unpredictability is becoming a strategy. And instead of denying this shift, it was named and confronted, that honesty created trust, and trust in a room full of skeptics is powerful currency. There was also a moral clarity woven into the message, not moralizing, but grounding. The assertion was simple: sovereignty matters, not just in principle, but in practice. When smaller nations are pressured, when economic threats replace dialogue, when force becomes a negotiating tool, the system begins to erode. And once erosion starts, no nation is immune. The walls that protect one economy today can be breached tomorrow. What made this moment truly compelling was its forward-looking nature. The focus wasn't on blame, but on action. Cooperation was frem. Not as idealism, but as necessity. Markets were described as resilient only when underpinned by trust. Innovation was portrayed as dependent on stability. Even growth itself was linked to predictability. This wasn't a speech for applause, it was a warning wrapped in realism, and the world noticed. Because in contrast to retreat and recalibration elsewhere, this was confidence without confrontation, authority without arrogance, leadership without spectacle. It reminded listeners that influence can be exercised by shaping the conversation, not just dominating it. That setting the terms of debate can matter more than winning a headline. In that moment, the contrast became impossible to ignore. One approach leaned on pressure and found its limits. The other leaned on coherence and found momentum. One narrowed options, the other expanded them, and in doing so, it reframed what leadership looks like in an era defined by uncertainty. This wasn't about stealing attention, it was about earning it. By articulating what's at stake, by acknowledging uncomfortable truths, and by offering a path forward that doesn't rely on fear. The message lingered long after the room moved on. It left behind a challenge, not just for governments, but for institutions, markets, and citizens alike. Decide whether the rules still matter, and if they do, decide who is willing to defend them.